Good day, educators. Welcome to another session entitled Four Pillars of Learning. This is your course facilitator, Dr. J. Pham, inviting you to put your thinking caps on as we talk about this important topic. Let's move along. The first question I have is, what is education? You now have 30 seconds to think about your own definition. Get a piece of paper and a writing utensil and jot down your definition. Please press pause now and start writing. Welcome back! Now that you have already written down your own definition of education, we will be comparing it later on to the definition that was submitted that became a basis of our topic today. But before that, let me reiterate that there are several factors that influence our definition of education. We have our beliefs, our values, our exposure, and our upbringing. These four factors contribute to our own philosophy that influences our definition of education. Let us now take a look on how education was defined, which will become the basis of our lesson today. UNESCO, which stands for United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, received a report from Delors in 1996. And in her report, she mentioned that the main mission of education is to develop all our talents to the full and to realize our creative potential, including responsibility for our own life and achievements of personal aims. This definition became the preamble of the four pillars of learning, a framework which was introduced by UNESCO and adapted by the international academic communities, including the Philippines. As a matter of fact, in 2002, for the basic education curriculum, the Department of Education used this framework to revise, assess, and redevelop the current curriculum. And this definition as well will become the basis of the four pillars of learning. So what are the four pillars of learning? Before I give you the four pillars of learning, I want to ask you a question first. What is a pillar? When you create or when you build any edifice, pillars are very important. This is where you make sure that they are sturdy, they're really strong, they can hold on weight. Because if the pillar is not properly built, then the building will collapse. Now, in education, there are four pillars. These pillars are very important because if these pillars are not fulfilled, then education will not be achieved. Basically, our topic today, it is going to introduce to us the four pillars or the four foundation or the four framework that must be seen in the education as well as in our curriculum today. Let us now proceed to the four pillars of learning. The four pillars of learning are to know, to do, to be, and to live together. Each of these four pillars will be discussed in depth in the next few seconds. But before that, let me inform you first of our learning outcomes. For our first learning outcome, after the discussion, I expect that you will be able to use your own words personally and be able to explain each of the four pillars of learning, which from here onwards, we will be using the FPL. Second is you will be assessing the observed current or previous practices, whether they do or they do not adhere to the goals of FPL. Later on, we will go back to these learning outcomes and check if we have achieved them. So, let us move now to the first pillar. One of the first mental skills is the reasoning skills. And going to the basic, we have numeracy, literacy, memory, problem solving, coherence, and critical thinking. These are the skills that a student must master in order for him to fulfill the first pillar. Remember, as I mentioned earlier, a student may find learning to learn very difficult if he is yet to master learning to know. It is very impossible for a learner to learn if he does not know how to concentrate and filter information. That's why learning to know precedes learning to learn. And we have to also understand that learning to know is both means and an end in learning. As a means, it serves to enable learners to understand concepts, experiences, and even abstract. As an end, it enables the learner to experience the pleasure of knowing, discovering, and understanding as a process. Basically, when we talk about learning to know, it is about preparing students to become self-directed learners, someone who is set to learn for life, someone who is not very dependent on the teacher. And so, what is the implication of learning to know to the teaching profession? There are some strategies that I will be sharing in order for us to fulfill the first pillar. As teachers, we first ourselves must develop our own mental skills in order for us to teach our learners how to hone theirs. After all, how can someone give if he doesn't have anything to give? So, in teaching our students, we must focus not only on teaching them the concept, but also on the process on how to acquire the concept. And that is what we call the metacognition skills. For example, in teaching mathematics, we must not be satisfied if our students can instantly answer 6 minus 3 is equals to 3. We must also teach them how to find the minuend and the subtrahend in a given word problem to come up with the difference. In teaching English, being able to read a poem is far from enough. Our learner must be able to decipher the meaning of unfamiliar words through context clues. They must be taught how to unearth meaning behind stanzas. In physics, it is not enough that learners know the formula of distance. They must also know when to translate the formula. Example, if the speed is missing and the distance and time are given instead of the regular problem wherein you are looking for distance. So definitely we have to train students to develop their metacognition skills. And second one is we must use the constructivist teaching methods. When we say constructivist teaching method, then here is when we allow the students to discover learning on their own using their metacognitive skills. And of course, it must be our desire to shun spoon feeding, because only by allowing our students to think, to process, to reason out, will they develop it. And by doing so, we are honing our students' critical thinking skills. So remember, in developing 21st century learners as teachers, it is our responsibility to become facilitator, catalyst, monitor, and evaluator of learning in order to help students to learn how to learn, to acquire tools to understand various concepts and the world in general, to develop critical thinking, and finally, to become a self-directed learner. We have already discussed the first pillar, which is learning to know. We will now move on to the second pillar, learning to do. Learning to do is beyond the application side of learning. Actually, when we say learning to do, the practical side of learning seems to be the first thought that pops out in our mind. Well, we reason out that practice and theory must come hand in hand anyway. And we say that since declarative knowledge has been addressed by learning to know, then learning to do must provide avenue for procedural knowledge. Well, indeed, skills are important. But remember, learning to do is beyond development of technical or vocational skills. Because in the 21st century, learning to do calls for a new type of skill, behavioral more than intellectual. There is a shift from developing learners' skill to developing learners' competence. It is more, let me repeat that, it is more on developing the learner's skill. It is not more on developing learner's skill, rather, it is more on developing learners' competencies. After all, our future workforce must master their occupational skills. Their foundational education and the specialist training in their undergraduates or their graduate degrees must pay off, right? But in order to fully deal with various situations that arise while or from performing their work, their behavioral competencies must be developed. This learning to do, it actually means soft skills. It is having the ability to communicate effectively with others, to develop aptitude toward teamwork, master social skills in building meaningful interpersonal relations, exhibit adaptability to change in the world of work and in social life, practice competency in transforming knowledge into innovations and job creation, and manifest readiness to take risks and resolve or manage conflicts. When you type soft skills on Google, it will tell you some of the 10 of the most common soft skills. We have here clear communication, listening skills, and others. And these are the skills, these are the competencies that must be present in order for learning to do to be materialized. Basically, when we say learning to do, let me repeat this. When we say learning to do, our student must learn the soft skills that they need in the workforce. But unfortunately, in many classrooms, the development of these competencies are overlooked or even undervalued. Thus, as future teachers, we must resolve that in teaching students a certain subject or course, we must endeavor to address these qualities that are needed in the workplace. We have to teach our learners how to manage themselves, how to work in teams, how to achieve common goals, how to effectively communicate their ideas in solving issues and minimizing, if not eradicating, unhealthy conflicts. We must also inculcate in their minds that it is not all about concepts and theories, but it also about competencies that matter. The learning strategies, the teaching strategies that we can do to develop the learning to do are the following. As I mentioned, we must provide opportunities to develop our students' soft skills. And how do we do that? By giving them group work. But let me emphasize this. When we teachers give our students group work, it is not enough that we just group them together. It will be very beneficial for students if they understand that there is a reason behind mere quote-unquote group work. That we also expect them not only to accomplish the task, but to also develop the soft skills. When there are conflicts among groups, if one member is not doing his or her work, instead of us meddling directly, allow them to resolve the conflict on their own. But if they can't really solve it on their own, then it is now our time to guide them. But let us not be too eager to solve issues on our own. Let them learn about it first. Teach them also how to delegate duties. That in order for things to work well, one person should not be overburdened. And in the course of doing all this, let us help them develop their leadership skills as well as their communication skills. So far, we've already talked about the first pillar, which is learning to know. And now we are done with the second pillar, learning to do. We will now move to the next pillar, learning to live together. When we say learning to live together, I'm not talking about a man and a woman living together before marriage. Okay? What I'm talking about here is something essential to education, and that is realizing that we now live in a globalized world. A globalized world where cultural borders and barriers are to be taken down if we want to harmoniously live together. And there is actually a song which goes that if we want to have peace on earth, then it must begin with me. It must begin with each of us. And so, learning together, it develops everyone's understanding of others and their history, their traditions, as well as their spiritual values. Now, when we have this understanding, it would create a euphoric society, which would come as a result of realizing that interdependency is the foundation of a civilized society. It means that by learning to live together, we can escape the vicious cycle of violence, abuse, and even greed. Now, what can we do then in order to help our students develop the third pillar? There are several strategies on how we can incorporate this paradigm in our curriculum. One of the practical example is to help learners realize that there is beauty and that there can be unity in diversity. Aside from that, let us lead our students to appreciate the value of being able to live together. Show them that we do not live for ourselves alone, but that we live interdependently with each other. Let us also model that we must always learn to wear other people's lenses prior to making conclusions about their opinions or perspective. Let us walk in someone else's shoes. Let us also teach them how to collaborate with each other, to open their minds to the rights of each individual, and to encourage them as well to appreciate these rights. We can also teach our students to take a look at the nature around us, because the nature teaches us that none of them live for and on their own. Animals, for example, they benefit from the oxygen of the trees, and the trees, they benefit for the carbon monoxide of that came out from the animals. And one thing that we can also do is to involve our students in outreach programs or in community extension services. By letting students to be exposed to what they can contribute to the society, and in the other end of the spectrum, see what they also need from others, then they can appreciate learning to live together. Stephen Covey, in his book, The Third Alternative, talks about synergy. Synergy eradicates my way and your way. Again, when we talk about synergy, it eradicates my way and your way. Instead, it encourages developing our way of thinking, our way. So there is no my way, there is no your way, but it is going to be our way. And Covey further noted that since most of the problem that we encounter depends on our paradigm, then we must have a paradigm shift. And let me present to you that synergy is the contemporary version of learning to live together. And this is where we, as teachers, must focus. We must help our students develop their synergistic minds. When everyone is not quick to judge others, but consider others' point of view, putting into picture their history, their personal value system, then our students can learn to live together. We have already discussed the first pillar, learning to know. We are also done with learning to do. And we just finished learning to live together. We will now proceed to the last pillar, which is learning to be. Education without holistic development of the learner's physical, mental, social, and spiritual aspect is not education at all. The four aspects, when synergistically honed, tapped, and utilized, fulfills the role of education in man. It is important to note that learning should not be at the expense of a learner's individuality. What do I mean by not at the expense of individuality? We have to understand that each learner is unique. Gardner's multiple intelligences theory tells us that each of us has our aptitude. We have dominant intelligence or intelligences, but we also have dormant ones that are waiting to be discovered and nurtured. Our individuality, the talent, the skills, aptitude, interests, and even weaknesses, which influence our personality, once properly considered and acknowledged, will bring great contribution to the society. And when a person learns to become who he is as designed by God, he will definitely fulfill his life's purpose. Again, it is when an individual learns to become who he is as designed by God that he can fulfill his life's purpose. So let me reiterate to you that learning should not be at the expense of our students' individuality, and that each learner is unique, and that Our individuality brings unique contributions to the society. So, what are the strategies that we teachers can use to develop or to ensure that the fourth pillar is upheld? It is our duty to provide multiple opportunities for learning. Gone are the days when students are assessed uniformly. Individuals' talents, intelligences, skills, aptitude, and interests should always be the center of the curriculum. Because students must be the center of our curriculum. Therefore, there should be opportunities for students to develop what they already have, and at the same time, they must also be aware and discover their dormant potentials. This would equip them to become great contributors in the society they live in. We have already discussed the fourth pillar. First, we talked about learning to know, learning to do, learning to be, learning to live together, and lastly, we talked about learning to be. So, in conclusion, let us understand that 4 pillars of learning guarantees complete education. When our learners are equipped to use their learning tools, which is learning to do, learning to know, and if they have developed their competencies, or we call also soft skills, which is learning to do, as well as being able to live together by being non-judgmental and by working synergistically, which is learning to live together, and developing their skills, their individuality, which is learning to be, then education will be completed. The learner must be equipped to use his mental powers in order to navigate the world of learning and continually acquire knowledge and skills. His competencies must continually be mentored so he can function effectively while applying the theories and technical skills that he has learned. The personal paradigm must be synergistically aligned with others so that he could live interdependently and peacefully while contributing to the welfare of everyone. And his personal individuality should never be compromised, but rather be constantly upheld and morally tuned. When these 4 pillars are strongly structured, then Nelson Mandela's mantra, education can change the world, can become a reality. Let us revisit our learning outcomes. Now that you have learned the 4 pillars of education, I believe that you can now use your own words to personally explain each of the 4 pillars of learning, and that you will now be able to reflect and assess your observed practices, whether they do or do not adhere to the goals of 4 pillars of learning. Should you have any question in our discussion today, please check the forum section in iStudy platform. Write your question there and I will answer it the soonest possible time. Again, thank you so much for joining us in our lesson today. God bless you and have a fruitful learning. Till next time, bye.